Hi, I'm Jamie. I have a couple of books to read for you today. The first one's called The Very Last Castle, with words by Travis Jonker and pictures by Mark Pett. In the middle of a small town stood something you might not expect, a castle. It was, in fact, the very last castle. There had been others, but over time they had all been taken down, or fallen apart, or been destroyed, all but one. For reasons no one could remember, no one ever came out, and no one was allowed in. Up in the tower, the guard watched the townspeople silently pass by. Then there was Ib. Every day she walked past the castle all alone. Every day she stopped. She looked up. She saw the lone guard standing stone still. Plunk. Since no one had been inside the castle, the townspeople had ideas about who or what was in there. Snap, snap, snap. Monsters, said Miss Wicks. Thud, thud, thud. Giants, said Alex. Hiss, hiss, hiss. Snakes, said Ib's grandfather. Maybe it's something terrible, Ib thought one day, but maybe it's something else. Plunk. The next morning, Ib walked past the castle. She stopped and looked up at the tower. No guard. Ib had an idea. She floated across the moat, walked up to the door, and with all the strength she had, knocked, knocked, knocked. Hiss! Ib didn't stop running till she was sitting in her desk at school, scared and out of breath. Maybe Grandpa was right. She didn't tell anyone what had happened. Not long after, an envelope arrived. Inside was an invitation. Your presence is requested at the front gate of the castle on Sunday at noon. Everyone told Ib to stay away. Monsters, said Miss Wicks. Giants, said Alex. Snakes, said her grandfather. Maybe it's something terrible, Ib thought. Could be something else. On Sunday, Ib stood all alone outside the front gate. With a loud thunk, the drawbridge began to lower. She trembled, and she looked up at the tower. Empty. She took a deep breath, and slowly Ib did something none of the townspeople had ever done. She walked inside. Turned out Miss Wicks and Alex had been right. There were monsters. And there were giants, but no snakes. Welcome, came a voice, a kind voice. It was the guard. He removed his helmet, and he was much older than Ib had expected. I'm the last one left. May I show you around? For the rest of the day, Ib and the guard, his name was William, visited every corner of the castle. Before long, they were pruning near the great hall. Snap, 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 and harvesting by the palace. Thud, thud, thud. They ended up where they had started. Why now? Asked Ib. All the other castles are gone, answered William. Someday I will be too. I want someone brave to take my place. Someone curious. Will you help me? Ib thought about William, all on his own. She thought about her family and friends outside the castle. She thought, and then she knew. Yes, Ib replied, but I have a request. In the middle of the small town stood the very last castle. Sometimes someone came out, and everyone was welcome in. Hiss! So we've got everybody to be able to go inside the castle. I have another book to read. It's called Dreams. It's by Ezra Jack Keats. It was hot. After supper, Roberto came to his window to talk with Amy. "Look what I made in school today. A paper mouse." "Does it do anything?" Amy asked. Roberto thought for a while. "I don't know," he said. Then he put the mouse on the windowsill. As it grew darker, the city got quieter. "Bedtime, Roberto," called his mother. "Bedtime for you too," other mothers called. "Good night, Amy." "Good night, Roberto." "Good night," echoed the parrot. Soon they were all in bed. Someone began to dream. Soon everybody was dreaming, except one person. Somehow, Roberto just couldn't fall asleep. It got later and later. Finally, he got up and went to the window. What he saw down on the street made him gasp. There was Archie's cat. A big dog had chased him into a box. The dog snarled. "He's trapped," thought Roberto. "What should I do?" Then it happened. His pajama sleeve brushed the paper mouse off the windowsill, and it sailed away from him. Down it fell, turning this way and that, casting a big shadow on the wall. The shadow grew bigger and bigger. And bigger. The dog howled and ran away. The cat dashed across the street and jumped through Archie's open window. "Wow, wait till I tell Archie what happened," thought Roberto. "That was some mouse." He yawned and went back to bed. Morning came and everybody was getting up, except one person. Roberto was fast asleep, dreaming. Bye for now. See you next time.
Hi, boys and girls. I'm Jo Toll. I'm here today to read you a couple of stories. So let's get started. The first book I'm going to read is called The Fish House Door, and it was written by Robert F. Baldwin and Astrid Shekels. I was steering my dad's lobster boat up the channel while Dad leaned back against the pilot house after a morning of hard work. As he idled through the harbor, I saw something standing on our dock. I couldn't tell what it was, but from the way he stared at the door of our fish house, I guess he must be a new summer person. He greeted us on the wharf. He was wearing clean faded jeans and a sweatshirt, and his name was Mr. Bruckner. He wanted to buy a couple of lobsters. "What size?" asked Dad. "Big enough for 2 hungry summer people," Mr. Bruckner said. He didn't ask the price. I climbed down to the float, hauled a crate of lobsters from the water, and grabbed a pair that looked about 1.5 pounds each. They thrashed about, waving their banded claws and snapping their wet tails. $15, Dad said. "Got something to carry them in?" The man shook his head. "Good thing you don't want more than 2, Dad said. With a lobster in each hand, Mr. Bruckner walked up the path toward the main road. Before he'd gotten 50 yards, he turned and waved a lobster in the direction of our fish house. "I like that door," he said. "Uh-huh," Dad called back. "It's a good door." I looked at the paint-smeared door, blazing red and yellow in the afternoon sun. Why, I thought, would a rich summer person say. He liked that beat-up old door. The door was a mess. Whenever Dad or I painted our trap buoys or repainted the skiff, we cleaned our paintbrushes against it. I kind of liked it, though, the same way I liked the stink of old bait bags and how the harbor smelled at low tide. They all reminded me of our island. What I couldn't figure out was why a stranger would like it. When we got up to the house, I handed Mom the mail we'd picked up at the post office. Met a new summer person, Dad told her. She didn't say anything and continued opening the mail. He told me he really liked the fish house door. She glanced up and raised an eyebrow. Well, shoot, Ann, that's not so strange, Dad said. I kind of like it myself. And by the way, he paid top dollar for lobster. He better pay for a lot of them, she replied. The bills just keep coming and coming. I've never really known if my family is rich or poor or somewhere in the middle. Once when I was younger, my older sister, Helen, said we were poor, but I'm not so sure. Dad says we have everything we need, including a house and a dock, and that plenty of millionaires would love to own. But we do seem to have a lot of bills. By the time I went down to the wharf the next morning, the sun was already peeking over the trees, and there wasn't enough breeze to stir the tops of the spruce trees surrounding the harbor. Most island men were already out hauling traps. The sounds of their engines floated across the smooth water and into the harbor. A few others were at the island lobster pound getting ready. We'd hauled most of our traps the day before, so Dad decided he'd give the lobsters another day to find our bait. Because they put the bait in the traps and wait for the lobsters to crawl in. Dad was sitting on a crate surrounded by freshly painted yellow and red trap buoys. Every lobsterman paints his buoys a specific color and pattern so they can tell who owns each and every buoy. There were some old wooden buoys laying around that Dad sold to tourists, as well as some broken traps in need of repair, and small coils of rope measured out in fathoms. The air was dry and smelled of spruce and the ocean. I got a brush and started helping him paint. I was painting the next to the last buoy when Mr. Bruckner stopped by again, this time carrying a bucket. Be right with you, Dad said. Mr. Bruckner stood off to the side and watched as we dipped the tips of our brushes into the red paint and carefully cut in along the edge of the yellow. When we were done, Dad handed me his brush. I stepped over to the fish house and wiped the wet brushes back and forth against the door, transferring the paint from bristle to board. When I turned, I saw Mr. Bruckner staring at the door with his head cocked slightly to one side. You an artist? Dad asked. He grinned. What makes you think that? Dad didn't say anything. No, I'm not an artist, Mr. Bruckner continued. I'm an art dealer. I own a gallery. I don't know much about art, Dad said, but I guess Sean and I have done a bit of painting in our time, huh, Sean? I nodded. You'd be surprised how many summer people buy lobster buoys, especially the old wooden ones, Dad told him. How about a couple for your gallery? Better yet, how about a hand-painted fish house door, he laughed. Mr. Bruckner looked at the door again. No thanks, just some lobsters will do today, he said. After he walked away, I looked at the door thinking how great it would be if an art dealer would really pay money for an old fish house door. I was doubtful, but Dad was a great salesman. He would have to be, like the rest of the old fish house. The door had seen better days. It was loose in the joints, and the screws had pulled out of some of the hinges. It didn't close tightly anymore, and we latched it with a short piece of rope. The front of the door was smeared with years and years of paint, mostly yellow and red, of course, but I could still see traces of blue and white. Those were your grandfather's colors, Dad said. I can remember the first time I hauled one of his blue and white buoys out of the bay. It was my 10th birthday, the day Pa decided I was old enough to do man's work. The sky had just begun to get light when we dropped our mooring and motored out. The moon was setting. The air was chilly and damp. I was shivering, but I felt proud that I was finally going out to haul traps. Back then, he continued, we would use wooden traps, and the harbor was lined with fish houses and working docks. When I wasn't hauling traps, I was baiting pockets for the old fishermen or helping repair traps in the fish house with your Grandpa Dick and Uncle John. The door must have looked different in those days, I said. It was blue and white mostly, with a lot more weathered boards showing between the paint streaks. You could still see traces of brown. Dad told me that the brown and white had been the color of Grandpa Alex's trap buoys, which were carved out of wood. Now they're made of foam. Grandpa Alec was actually my great-grandfather, but I never met him. What was he like? I asked. Well, he wasn't great at fishing or lobstering, but he was a terrific boat builder and carpenter. Dad said there were 32 or so families living on the island year-round when Grandpa Alec built the fish house. There was even a year-round store. Nearly all the men fished, but Grandpa spent as much time building dories as fishing. He didn't get paid much for them, Dad said, but there was a time when most island men fished from boats built by their great-grandfather, and before that, his father. In the summers, the passenger ferry used to visit twice a week, but during the winter, people had to use their own boats to get to the mainland. We didn't have any telephones or electricity either. When the weather was bad, we were cut off from the rest of the world. During winter storms, I used to crawl into Grandpa Alex's lap in the chair next to the wood stove while the bay exploded against the icy rocks and the tide surged down the harbor. He'd smoke his pipe and tell me about trips on the coasting schooners that sailed all the way to Portland and Boston and Baltimore. I really loved that man. When I was 8, we moved off the island to go to mainland school. One day, his boat caught on fire off Parsons Ledge. They never found him. What did he look like? What I remember were his thick, calloused hands and the color of his eyes. They were brown, just like trap buoys. Every summer, Dad and his family returned to the island just like our family does. He hauled traps with his father until it was time to go back to school, just like I do. Someday, I'll have my own lobster boat, too. Mr. Bruckner was renting the Morris house for the whole summer, and we saw him 2 or 3 times a week. He would come by with his bucket to buy lobsters, sometimes just a couple for his wife and himself, sometimes a bunch for his guests. He often looked at the fish house door and even took some pictures of it, but he didn't really mention it again. Then one day toward the end of August, just before he was going to leave, Mr. Bruckner asked if he could go out with us on the boat to haul traps. I suppose so, Dad said, as long as you're willing to stay out there until I'm done. Actually, he was pretty useful. He even baited some pockets, and he didn't get seasick either. On the way home, I started thinking about the fish house door. Before I took off my boots, I deliberately stopped in front of the fish house and studied it the way Mr. Bruckner had done the first day I'd met him. I pretended I was admiring a famous painting to see what he would say. "Ah, yes," Mr. Bruckner said, "the fish house door masterpiece." I looked at him to see if he was trying to be funny. He wasn't smiling. He had that look that summer people get when they want something. Dad must have noticed it too, because he walked over and began admiring the door with me. "You still like that door?" Dad said. "Still do," Mr. Bruckner said. "I like the improbable combination of colors and textures." Dad didn't say anything. "Look at the way the weathered wood shows through where the paint is peeled off and the little flecks of old colors. And look over here, he said, pointing to a bare patch of wood where Grandpa Alec had once sketched a boat design. It looks like some old boat builder once used this part of the door as a drawing board. And over here, someone added up a column of numbers, maybe selling lobsters to summer people. Mr. Bruckner sounded like he was the one trying to sell the door. You can't plan that kind of beauty, he said. It just happens, artlessly. It's a simple work created by simple fishermen, and it happens to be magnificent. Maybe Mr. Bruckner didn't know much after all. The door was just a door, and Dad was about to sell it for way more than any simple fisherman would pay. Would you take $500 for it? Mr. Bruckner asked. $500? I thought, yes. I turned away to hide my smile as I ran my hand across the streaks of dry paint. Dad lifted his cap and ran his fingers through his hair. Wow, can you imagine $500 for an old painted door? 1,000? Mr. Bruckner asked, but this time I barely heard him. I had noticed something on the door, a tiny patch of brown paint, almost covered up by the new brighter colors. As I stared at it, I imagined the eyes of my great-grandfather. I could picture him telling stories at the wharf and imagining the smell of wood smoke and pipe tobacco and the roar of winter surf. Dad stepped a little closer to see what I was staring at, and he saw the brown paint too. Okay, Mr. Bruckner said, make it 2,000. I listened to the waves lapping the rocks under the dock. The bright colors of the door sparkled in the sunlight. I couldn't take my eyes off it. Every smear of red, white, yellow, and brown looked like it belonged just where it was. It really was a masterpiece. Sorry, Dad said. Mr. Bruckner shook his head. It's an excellent price. Dad was silent, but I knew what he was thinking. Mr. Bruckner, I said, that might be a good price for a simple piece of art. But this is my family's fish house door. We wouldn't sell it for $1 million. Now, would you like any lobsters to take home with you? The end. That was a really interesting story. I guess their fish house door was quite the masterpiece, but it was worth more than any money could buy. All right, the next story is a little bit shorter. It's called A Little Ferry Tale, and it's written by Chad Otis. So let's get started. Once, not so long ago, in a place with more water than land, there was a little fairy who took people to visit a little island. Every day, people whooped and hooted over Tugboat, who was rough and fearless. They cheered for Speedboat, who thundered by in a blur. And they marveled at Sailboat, who was carefree and graceful. Little Ferry watched the watchers and wished that she was fearless, or thundery, or graceful. She knew she was patient and quiet and careful and always on time, even when she was sleepy or grumpy or just didn't feel like it. But no one hooted or cheered or marveled at that. Then she had an idea. And for the first time ever, little Ferry veered off course. I wonder where she was going. And raced as fast and loud as she could after the speedboat. Vroom! But Speedboat zipped circles around her. Little Ferry, you're too slow and quiet. You weren't made for this. So she tried being carefree and graceful like the sailboat. Little Ferry, you're much too careful. You weren't made for this. But little Ferry was determined, so she made up her mind to be rough and fearless like Tugboat. Well, she'd be rough and fearless just as soon as this boat passed, and this one, and this one. Little Ferry fearlessly huffed a rough huff to catch up, but Tugboat was far off in the distance. Little Ferry, you waited too long, Tugboat tooted. You certainly were not made for this. They're right, thought the little Ferry, as she sadly turned back around. I just wasn't made to be any of those things. She was nearly back at the dock when she heard toot. It was Tugboat. Oh no, is that smoke? The animals on the island must need our help. Speedboat got there first, roaring in like a flash, but he startled the animals. Tugboat hurried in next, but that only frightened the animals. The sailboat curved up to the shore, but she didn't watch out for the rocks and scraped her hull. Little Ferry paced back and forth, back and forth. I want to help, she fretted. I'm not fast or fearless or tough or graceful, but I have to try. Little Ferry was quiet as she neared the shore. She was slow and careful as she lowered her ramp, and she was patient as she waited for the animals to climb on. Soon Little Ferry was filled up, but more animals kept coming, and she started to tip. Oh no, I'm too small, she sputtered. And she heard a tiny voice. You can do it, Little Ferry. You are made for this. And all of a sudden, Little Ferry didn't feel quite so little anymore. She floated higher, straightened up, and somehow every last animal made it on board. Then she slowly, carefully carried everyone to safety. Forever after, Little Ferry brought people back and forth to the little island, happy knowing that she was best at being exactly who she was. The end. So she wanted to be like all those other boats, but it just wasn't her. She had to be herself. We all have to be ourselves. Thanks for listening today, and we'll see you again soon.